Ok. Hola amigos de Lemas, estamos hoy con Ryan La Sala para platicar de su libro Reverie, el cual está siendo publicado ahora por VR Editoras. Hi Ryan, how are you?
I'm so good. Thank you for having me. How are you?
No, thank you for coming. Good, thank you. So your book is amazing. Um,
Yeah.
and I wanted you to, if you can talk about how you approach writing a story that embodies the queer experience beyond like the surface representation.
Absolutely. So I wrote Reverie out of a need to see characters like me in fiction. I started it when I was in high school, which in the United States, that's when you're about like 17 or 18. So I was the same age as the characters, and I was just writing down a story that I wanted to read. And so I wasn't thinking so much about illustrating a queer experience or writing a gay book. There were no other books out there that sort of felt like that, so it wasn't a market niche that I could write into. It was purely a selfish desire to entertain myself and to write a story that I wanted to read.
Yeah.
And because I'm actually like a queer kid growing up, and because I was an actual queer teenager, I think it just ended up being indicative of a lot of like queer experiences. And so I'm very happy that people have found themselves reflected in it, but I have to admit it's sort of a happy accident because I was just writing to entertain myself.
So you never planned on being a writer before that? It just came like naturally?
Kind of. People ask me sometimes when I knew I was a writer, and the honest answer is I've always known. Like ever since I was a little kid, I've always just been writing stories in my head. And even like now, if I'm walking in the street and I see something interesting, I try to think of like how I would write it down, how I would tell somebody else. And I've always loved storytelling. And so I was telling other stories as a teenager. I loved to make up games with my friends. I loved to do all sorts of stuff that involved basically writing, but I never thought, oh, I'm gonna become an author. That was never something that I really thought was gonna end up happening for me. I was just kind of doing it for fun.
Okay, great. Talking about like making stories and like saying something that isn't out there, because I remember growing up and not having any queer stories, something like fairly recently.
Hmm.
So there's a quote in your book that says, "People like us, we must tell stories ourselves, or else they will destroy us in their own violent making." It's such a powerful quote. Can you talk more about your perspective on queer storytelling and why it's like so important for these stories to be told by queer voices themselves and not like others
Absolutely.
telling their stories?
Yeah, there's such a power in realizing that the power that people have over you, the ability of them to kind of control you or tell stories about you can be completely overcome by telling that story yourself. And many queer people understand what I'm talking about because they remember what it was like to be in the closet and sort of have this story be told about you or about people like you, and to not be able to raise your own hand and be like, no, that's not the truth. That's not who I am. It's not my story. So I wanted to include that quote because Posey says it in I think like the second chapter, and Posey's this like character that Kane immediately looks up to because they seem to be so comfortable with themselves and so like in control of that. And so I wanted to give the opportunity to a teen to kind of hear from a queer elder about what it means to take control of your story.
Yeah, that's so true. And also, like, there's this part where Kane realizes everyone knew he was gay before he even knew he was gay,
Yeah,
and everyone was talking about it, and everyone was like telling stories. So there's this need like to empower yourself and like tell your own story and have control of that. And I
yeah,
think like as a teenager, that's like really hard because you're in that age where you don't even know what you want for breakfast and you don't know what you're going to do tomorrow, and like life is so overwhelming. So
yeah.
when you were writing this, like, were you trying to make sense of it all within yourself? Like, how was that experience?
I always was so I'm very flamboyant, and so even from like a very young age, like everybody, just like Kane, like everybody knew I was gay before I did, and it
Yeah.
sort of was a story that caught up with me. And so that's all very true. But also while writing Kane, I wanted to write a queer character who doesn't really have like a weakness, at least as it pertains to their sexuality. So like Kane, for instance, Kane's gay, but that's not why Kane is weak or insecure. Kane has a lot of other stuff going on with him, like his missing memory and his magic, but he knows who he is. And I specifically wrote that because I wanted to write a queer character who isn't made vulnerable necessarily by an insecurity around that. Kane's definitely still targeted because of their queerness, but like me as a teenager, I wanted to write someone who knew um that they were a good person, that they had no sort of fundamental flaw concerning their sexuality. And I think characters like that are interesting because it frees them up to focus on other things and other adventures.
I feel like even now that we have more queer voices telling stories and more queer stories around, they mostly focus on like their coming out story or like
Yeah,
whatever like the problem is revolving around being queer. And it's like so refreshing to see that and see that the problem is not being like queer or your identity. Like the problem is
mhm.
dealing with everything else like a total normal teenager. That is what they
Totally.
are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so amazing. And talking about Posey, that drag queen sorceress is just amazing and is described like as a fantastic foil to Kane. And the two characters
Mhm.
seem to represent different aspects of like the queer experience, you know, like being this flamboyant, as you were saying, so, and Kane is just like more discreet with his life and just dealing with being a teenager. How did you develop this dynamic between them, and what do you think Posey brings to Kane's journey?
Oh, I love Posey. Probably one of my favorite characters that I've ever written. She is just the embodiment of power, but more so than just being powerful, she also embraces her power, right? Like Kane and her kind of have really similar powers, but Posey knows how to use her magic, and she's willing to ask the question of why would you save a world when you could change it, when you could
I
create
love that.
something
Yeah.
even better? And the reason I wanted to ask that question is because I think that there's something really valid about many queer people in generations before mine who grew up in a very unkind world or came from places even today where they're not accepted, and expecting them to have sort of this naive hope about how people can change is kind of extraordinary. So I think that having instead a character who has power, who embraces it, and who wants to do something about it and to create something brand new is really interesting, but it's also really true. I think that the book is largely about what it means to not run away from reality, what it means to not sort of vanish into fantasy. And Posey represents that vanishing, whereas Kane is young enough to sort of be of the generation where some people are accepting and some people aren't, but ultimately the task ahead of Kane feels much more about altering reality rather than destroying it. And I think it's a valid question. I think it's a great question to have a character sort of think through of like, yeah, why would I try to fix this? Like, is this not bad? Who is this helping? Um, and so I mean, I won't spoil how the book ends, but Kane definitely wrestles with that question.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us have as well too. I think especially readers oftentimes don't realize that they're wrestling with the idea of changing the world or escaping from it.
Yeah, I feel like there's a really thin line between them. And with Reverie, it
Mhm.
explores like really well the development between that thin line because it's like you can stay in your reverie, right? Like for your
Yeah,
dreams, like
forever.
Helena does, and she's like trying to build like her perfect life. But at the end, there's always gonna be this plot twist, right? That
Hmm.
something's gonna change and you're gonna have to deal with it. And it's really important to have like the equipment that's how you're gonna deal with it like in real life. So I think
Totally.
it's amazing. And it's so amazing that you build that for like teenagers who are going through that when your life is full of plot twists all the
Oh my
time.
gosh, yeah, and teenagers specifically, I mean, that's when you start to understand like how much power you actually do have as a person, because you're about to be in the world of adults and you can sort of still sort of look at it from afar, but you're starting to kind of awaken to this ability to change reality. And it sounds so like corny. I know it sounds corny, but I really do think that like young people have an incredible amount of power in that our reality is shaped by, you know, individual choices and group action and things that are sort of in the novel. And so I don't think that teens are altogether that different than the ones that I'm writing about that do have these like crazy psychic abilities.
Yeah, no, it's like be apart from their psychic abilities and the magic that they have, they're going through like real life and like
Yeah.
navigating relationships and friendships and like how are you going through high school and your relationship with your parents and your sister and what you're gonna do in the future. So it's such a book that hits like home, like when you're growing up. So it's amazing what you've done with it.
Thank
And
you.
another thing is Reverie speaks to the queer struggles in a raw and like an often painful way. And how important was it for you to write a book that doesn't shy away from the more uncomfortable aspects of the queer experience, like especially for young readers?
Yeah. I didn't want to write a book about coming out. I think that there are some really incredible stories that are portraying that particular experience. I wanted to write a book about a queer person having their own adventure, sort of, asking the question of what happens after you come out of the closet, what's the next adventure? But at the same time, I didn't want to lean into the phenomenon that we've been seeing recently of really utopic depictions of queer people where like they don't really have many problems with their sexuality. They're just simply existing and there's like no homophobia whatsoever, right? And those stories are great too. I really love those stories as well. But I wanted to do something in the middle where a queer person comes out and they have a big adventure and they're dealing with other problems, but they're still in a world that is reacting to the fact that they're queer and they're still having to make choices that are largely informed by this. Like my identity, I'm very secure in, but no matter how secure I am and who I am, the world is going to react to me in ways that I just cannot control. And so while the book is very fantastical, I actually think that that's a really realistic depiction of what it means to be a queer person because queer people are so good at sort of walking into a room and realizing that the rules have changed for them, that they've got to be someone specific to that particular room. And we do that when we go see our families or when we're out in public or when we're at our job, but we're always adapting. That's partly why I wanted to write about a group of characters, teenagers that sort of show up in these worlds and have to very quickly figure out who they are in the context of this world in order to kind of play that part, because that's what it means to be safe. That's what it means to kind of code switch into sort of a safe portrayal of yourself. And so a lot of it kind of comes down to skill sets that I think like if you're part of that cast, I think part of being good at that comes down to skill sets that I think a lot of queer people develop just based on, the world that we live in.
Yeah, that's for sure. And also one thing I love about Posey is that they are not afraid to take space. Like they're not afraid to show how they are and like how fluctuant they are. And something that I love is that the pronouns change throughout the book as
Mhm.
we get to know more Posey. And when I was a teenager and I was reading like young adult novels and like fiction, that was impossible to see. So
Yeah.
what do you think is the importance of getting to know like characters who are fluctuations and experiences in writing for the first time with fluctuant pronouns that is like fairly new in the literature world?
Absolutely. I mean, pronouns get sort of a lot of discussion, right?
Yeah.
Like how to use them, but like any reader knows that you use pronouns all the time to refer to any number of things that don't have a specified gender, right? And so I think people are better at it than they first understand. And I wanted to write Posey with these shifting pronouns because I wanted to show that the way that Posey sort of performs a specific gender largely sort of that's what determines sort of how Kane reacts to them. And so they start out sort of ambiguous, they're a man, but then they show up and when they're in drag, like many drag queens, they use like she, her pronouns and they kind of go back and forth as the book depends. But Posey sort of is at her most powerful when she's fully in her like glamorized drag performer outfit. And so I wanted to make sure that the reader understood that for many people, gender is something that's very fluid and that kind of can change minute to minute depending on who they are, what they're doing, what they're wearing, and how they feel. So, Kane and Posey never have, I think, like a really deliberate conversation about it. But I thought even just by including it, I could kind of give readers a safe place to experience what it might be like to chat with somebody who's like that. Because people who are gender fluid, like myself, like we're all over the place, and you're going to meet those people eventually, and you're going to think, oh, wait, I know someone just like you. It's a maniacal drag queen sorceress in a novel, but at least you will have had the experience there first before chatting with someone in person. Or maybe reading that, you might think, oh my gosh, like that's how I feel. That's how I feel when I get dressed a certain way versus another way. And I kind of wish that the world would react to me in specific ways too. And if that's the case, then good.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I also feel like it's so important to talk about pronouns like in the literature world when people are like so attached to like, no, this is how grammar works and this is how you
Mhm.
write a book. So
Oh, it's
that's,
crazy. Yeah.
yeah, it's amazing that you are like starting to get out there and saying like, it's this easy. This is how you read it. And this is how people work in the real life too. So great.
Yeah, yeah, it's totally normal. I mean, look, in my life, it's very normal, but I realize that that's not everybody's life too. So I think books are great though because they allow you a glimpse into other ways of being a human. And so my hope is that it kind of offers that for people.
Yeah, that's amazing. Also, the idea of reveries is like a manifestation of often deep and hidden desires and fears also. And it seems to connect the themes of identity and particularly with queer individuals. So, can you explain on how you use the magic system to explore the subconsciousness and the queer identity?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So this is the most fun part of writing this book. I wanted to create a magic that actualized the subconscious desires of a person. And this is sort of largely inspired by like I remember if anyone's ever seen the movie Paprika, it's an anime movie, and it's the movie that inspired Inception, which I think a
Oh,
lot of people have seen too, where the people are sort of in this like shared dream world. But um, the idea of sort of taking something like this, it allows you so much freedom. And honestly, it was fun. It was fun to sort of think to myself, like, well, if Helena's Reverie is this Victorian romance, like what could go wrong? How could this twist into something really scary? And it was only later in the book's writing, I had sort of written the whole book and it was about to be turned into my editor that I was like, oh, what if the Fabergé eggs that she collects, like what if those hatch? What if there are these like glittering monsters? And sort of pulling on that thread was largely how I wrote a lot of the book because I wanted the scenes to be familiar. I wanted those like fantasy scenes to be familiar, like a reader can sort of recognize they've seen, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, or they've seen like Pride and Prejudice. So they kind of have a framework for where these dreams begin, where the reveries begin. But I wanted to simulate the experience of being in a real dream and sort of opening a door that you're not supposed to open and having the dream sort of fall apart around you and become weirder and weirder as you go. And so it was fun. It was a great time. But it also sort of allowed me to put characters that don't normally get to be in like a Regency romance or into like an adventure down in some hidden temple in a volcano. Like it kind of allowed me to put my characters in those positions. And so as an author, it was a dream come true because I wasn't stuck writing just like one story because the magic that I had dreamed up for these characters allowed me to write them into like a bunch of different worlds where they got to experience everything from, like really restrictive feminine codes in like the Reverie, that's like the secretary one, to like romance to like hidden secrets. And that's kind of the true joy of that book. And that's why I loved writing it, to be honest.
I love reading about it and seeing all these characters in so many different situations and like the Sophia Reverie that is like the teenage dystopia and she's like
I
such a
love the
feminist. It
dystopian
was so
Reverie.
fun to read and like this popular queen bee that is like getting threatened because you're the popular queen bee. So it was so fun to read it.
Honestly, the whole book it was an excuse to put Ursula into increasingly like less like combat worthy outfits and then making her do all the combat anyways. Like that was my true goal for the
I
book was
love the
just
wedding
taking
scene,
her,
like
yeah,
Ursula
poor Ursula
hiding in
was
her
really
wedding dress. Yeah.
yes, exactly like tackle like body wrestling like a giant dragon while in like a wedding gown. Like that's what I wanted. That to me was like the real stuff of it. And everything else I sort of had to arrange around making sure that those scenes got to happen.
That's amazing. I love it. And also they have such an amazing friend group. Like you have such a diverse group. Ursula is like this girl who doesn't want to be that tough, but she is, and like the powers they have is like something that they hate or hide from themselves, or they don't want to admit that they are. So how do you come up with that idea?
Yeah, I think that oftentimes the things that we feel like make us vulnerable are the things that can often lead to our biggest strengths. And so it was important to kind of give each character a power that they really didn't want, but sort of consistently had to use. So Ursula is really self-conscious about how big she is and how strong she is, but it's the thing that allows her to protect the people that she loves. And Adeline is really concerned about people thinking that she's lying, but all she can do is sort of create these false memories. But that's what allows her to save people from being plagued by things that they wish they could forget, and so on and so forth. Right down to Cain, who sort of begins fearing his own ability to kind of cause these dreams to collapse in on themselves. But ultimately, um, it's his ability to sort of destroy and to start over that combines with the major lesson that he needs to learn, which is that being sensitive and being and allowing yourself to kind of be fragile is what allows you to be sensitive enough to kind of be in tune with the larger world and what you might need from it. And so each of the characters, I wanted to make sure that their power had something to do with the type of person that they are, or the type of person that they need to become in order to be at their most powerful. And so I kind of wish that I got to write more about these specific backstories because each of them has, a whole book that I could probably write about them. But this sort of felt like the right way to arrange a cast so that even when they're using their magic, you're still learning about the kind of person that they are.
Yeah, I love that. Even if they don't have like their full backstory on the book, I feel like you get to know them pretty well and get to understand them. And that's so
Hmm.
important when you write a book, right? Like, don't focus only on the main character, like the rest of the cast is so important too.
I think so
And
too, yeah.
yeah, I feel like they're a great friend group, even if Kane doesn't think it like throughout the book
I know,
sometimes.
I know. That's
Yeah.
what I think that's the sad thing about the book is that Kane doesn't remember sort of the whole history that he has with these people, um but if I could ever, I think writing a prequel to Reverie would be
Yeah.
a great opportunity to sort of explore how the group formed and, what those first reveries looked like and how they learned how to use their powers. But, for the sake of the fact, it had to be one book. And so I had to start it kind of right there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would have been like way too long.
I was actually thinking that when I finished the book, I was like, I would love to read like how Kane got into this, like how was the
Hmm.
reverie that formed all of this, and how such a diverse group of friends like got together. Because I wouldn't picture like Adeline and Ursula being like close from the start, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And
Totally.
that's
Totally.
something that I love about the book too. Like, I don't know, when you're growing up, I feel like you always think you have to belong to one clique and you have to fit in
Hmm.
with like a certain group. And it's amazing seeing how they explore and like grow from the different perspectives and become such like
Hmm.
a rich group.
Hmm.
So it always like the point to making this diverse group to be like completed each other, or it was just like a natural instinct like to write them like that?
I loved the idea of taking kids that typically wouldn't be friends with one another and forcing them to be friends because
Yeah.
it causes them to have to reanalyze their first impressions of one another. Because you're right, Ursula and Adeline would not normally ever be caught dead talking to one another in a high school, but within a reverie, suddenly it doesn't matter, that Adeline's this popular girl and Ursula's this jock. They've got to work together. And they do. And I wanted to show that a lot of times the sort of petty assumptions that we make about people are wrong. I think high school is in and of itself, high school being what we call in the United States, but school in general, it's kind of like its own reverie, right? It's a world that you enter into that kind of has its own fantasy about who you get to be, the limits of the world, and as you start to kind of break those rules, the system kind of reacts, and that's how social hierarchy works too. And so I think that a lot of those dynamics are just as concocted as some of the rules that are in the reveries about who people get to be and what happens if you decide to be somebody else.
It's amazing. And also I have a question about like the parents in the book.
Mm,
Relationship with parents are so hard, especially when you're a teenager and you're growing up and you don't know like how do you want them to be? Like they're starting to
mhm,
become like a distant figure, but you also need them more than anyone in their life. So Kane has like this really difficult situation with his parents because he's like he doesn't remember what he's going through, and the parents don't know like what he's going through. And Ursula also has like a really weird relationship with his dad and his new
mhm.
brothers and sisters. So how important was to you to write about like that aspect of their life?
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that it was clear that each of these kids was coming to the book with their own life behind them, right? Like I wanted them to feel like real people. And so, um, Kane's particular relationship, I think, is really interesting because he doesn't quite remember the relationships that he has with people, and his family doesn't trust him. They think that he tried to do something really horrible to himself, but he feels like he didn't try to do that. So they're trying to protect him, but instead what they're doing is they're limiting his ability to like figure out the truth.
Yeah.
Um, and his sister specifically is this person who she can tell that her brother is once again kind of vanishing into the unknown. And unlike the last time when he did this and didn't come back with his memory, she decides that she's gonna follow him in. And that to me is like it's much more interesting than the first draft of this book, where Sophia, I don't think was as major of a character. She didn't have sort of this big role at the end of the book. It was like somebody else's reverie at that moment. But the second I figured out that, oh, I've got this great little sister to do something with, it gave me the chance to show that like even in this world, if you don't have like these crazy cool psychic powers, because Sophia doesn't have any conscious power, but she still sort of has this incredible capacity to produce these like amazing dreamt worlds. And that's kind of what her skill is. And so I wanted to show that in relationship to Kane's powers, but then also, people like Ursula and Adeline and Elliot, I wanted to make sure that all of their families had real people in them, because largely the shaping of those characters comes down to the people that they care for and the people that they love, and the responsibilities that they owe to the people that exist in our reality, because they can't just destroy reality, right? Like if you decide to destroy reality for yourself, you're kind of doing it for everybody. You're making that choice. And there's a selfishness inherent to the way that Posey operates that resonates with the fact that she doesn't have anybody. There's nobody that she loves or cares about in this world. So, of course, she wants to tear through it. But everybody else on the other side of this, they've got real people that are just trying to live their lives and that want to see them come home. And so I wanted to draw a contrast between those two types of decision making.
That's so great. Yeah. And finally, I love to ask this question. What do you want your readers to get when they finish the book? Like, what is the feeling you want them to have when they close the book?
Okay. I think I know that I wrote the book so that if you finish it and you want to reread it and you do reread it, you're going to find a lot of little clues hidden in Kane's story that tell you exactly kind of what he's going through before he even realizes it. But ultimately, my biggest hope as an author is that someone finishes my book, closes it, puts it down, and sort of looks around at their own world and thinks, oh my gosh, like I can change my own reality. I can do something about the things in my life that make me sad or frustrated, or make me scared. Our realities they're soft, right? And oftentimes, they don't change because we don't let them change. But if you are like Kane and you sort of feel a bit alien in your own world, then maybe you just have to find your own version of the others, or your own versions of friends that give you kind of the confidence to shape your own world. And that's kind of the major goal that I had with writing Reverie.
That's so amazing. I love that. I had that feeling when I finished the book.
Good.
And Kane says, like, no, I want to like keep this reality and I want to work with it. Because I feel like
Hmm.
sometimes we feel like we have to start from zero and scrap like everything so we can get like a fresh new start or like finally get something good. But that's not true. It's like you have to work with it. And I feel like that's such a meaningful thing to say. And also, like
Yeah.
within the queer community, they didn't scrap the world. They have been building it from zero and making all these
Yeah.
crazy advances and like getting themselves out there and speaking louder and getting all these rules to change. So that's such an amazing thing to like trespass with the
Totally.
book.
Totally.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you for
Thank you
having
for
this talk
having
with
me. This
me.
was so much fun. Thank you for
It was
having me.
so
These
much
were
fun too.
wonderful questions.
Oh, thank you so much. And I hope you write that prequel because I really wanted to.
I'm thinking about it. I'm working on a project right now that's not that, but in the back of my head, as I've been talking more about Reverie, I've been thinking I want to get back to it at some point too. So I
You
can't make
should.
any
You
promises,
definitely
but
should.
it's on my list.
Good. Wait, now that you mentioned your new project, can you tell us more about it before we go?
A little bit. So it's
Yeah.
not announced yet, but it should be announced soon. It's a horror novel that takes place on an island where something comes out of the water and starts to change the people on this island. So it's scary, it's crazy. It kind of feels a lot like Reverie in the sense that it's pretty surreal, but it's more in the horror genre, but not too scary. So don't worry too much. But yeah, if you like Reverie, I think you'll like this too.
Okay, thank you. I'm so intrigued to read it.
Yeah.
And thank you again for having this talk with me.